Well, today is day 2 of what is now being called a recovery mission, and the rain will most likely make those efforts even more difficult. The NTSB has recovered 2 black boxes from the Potomac River. Officials say it will take time to put together answers.
You need to give us time. You need to give NTSB, it's not that we don't have information. We do have information. We have data. We have substantial amounts of information. We need to verify information. We need to take our time to make sure it is accurate. That's best for you. That's important for the families. It's important for legislators who are seeking answers to try to figure out what they're going to do about this. And so it will take time. We do have a lot of information, but we need some time to verify that.
And according to reports, the FAA has now restricted helicopter flights near Washington Reagan National Airport. Recent reports from the Associated Press state that only police and medical helicopters in that area between the airport and nearby bridges will be allowed. In total, 67 people were killed when a Black Hawk helicopter collided with an American Airlines plane near Reagan National Airport. Many of the victims on board that plane were part of a figure skating community. That includes at least 14 people from the Ashburn Skate House in Loudoun County. Joining us now to discuss all things surrounding this is U.S. Navy Captain retired Mr. Armen Kurdian back here on the Fox 5 Live Zone. Good to see you, Mr. Kurdian. Welcome back to the show.
Happy Friday, Guy. Thanks for having me.
I just want to bring you up to speed very quickly. We are awaiting for a press conference with D.C. Mayor Muriel Bowser and the D.C. Fire Department. When that happens, we're going to take that live right here on the Live Zone. Mr. Kurdian, with regard to what you have seen thus far and been told thus far, obviously surrounding this horrific accident, the question is, how could this happen?
It's going to be a number of factors that are going to come together to have caused this to happen. I don't think you're going to find one single particular issue which caused this problem. It's going to be probably a combination of human error and system mechanical or computer error. When I say human error, it could be, one or both aircraft. It could be the air traffic controller. It could even be folks who were not there. It could be perhaps, you have to look at training. You have to look at hiring practices. You have to look at the maintenance of the aircraft. You have to look at seeing whether the systems on both of those aircraft were working right. It is certainly incredibly improbable when you think about it for something like this to happen, but that's why they're accidents, because the improbable ends up lining up, as we call in the Navy, the Swiss cheese theory.
Yeah, Mr. Kurdian, just last hour we learned that the FAA has indefinitely closed helicopter routes near Reagan National Airport. Some would argue too little, too late.
Well, they're probably just doing this precaution. They may not have a particular reason or fact that they know that would all these kinds of operations, because they've been operating in that area for a very, very long time, for years. So this could be just say, hey, let's cross our T's and dot our I's. It could also be maybe to show the public that they're actually doing something. I think ultimately we'll see those helicopter operations resume. You kind of need to, because that's going to cause a major headache for news choppers, military aircraft, the Coast Guard, or other vehicles on these training missions that need to operate in that area.
Yeah, well, speculation is one thing. Finding the facts, that happens to be another, and that's where the NTSB comes into play. The Black Hawk helicopter may have veered off. We're getting reports of that possibly could have been the case and been higher than it was supposed to be. Yet again, how could that happen?
Well, let's take a look at this. The helicopter pilots probably believed they were flying at a particular altitude. There's 2 questions you want to ask. Number one, was the helicopter reporting its altitude correctly, being its TCAS or its IFF mode C transponder? Or secondly, was the altimeter properly set? Was, say, the altimeter that the pilots used to set the barometric altitude, was it set too high or too low, which would cause the pilots to not realize that they were flying at the wrong altitude, even though perhaps their radar altimeter wasn't working or wasn't agreeing, or maybe their radar altimeter wasn't working and that was their only means of altitude. So you see all these factors in and of themselves singularly may not cause an accident, but when 3 or 4 of these things line up, no matter how improbable it is, even if it's a 1 in 1 million chance, it does happen. And when you consider the volume of air traffic in the United States and the lack of frequency of fatal accidents, I can assure the American people that it is safe to fly, and the air traffic controllers we do have operating in those high density areas are the best in the world. But we do need more of them, and I'm sure we're going to find ways to improve the system following this mishap.
Yet again, we are still awaiting the facts, and that will be coming forth by the NTSB. It's also been speculated that the pilots in the helicopter, the Black Hawk helicopter, may have very well been suffering from fatigue. Is that something that typically happens?
I can tell you that several years ago, there were a lot of incidents with fatigue in naval aviation. It was realizing that this was causing a lot of problems in training accidents. So fatigue is a very, very real factor, and they will look at that.
All right. Yet again, just such a tragic incident taking place on the Potomac River. A lot of folks asking why the Washington, D.C. area is challenging to fly in. Those of us who live here have done it many a times, particularly in the case of Ronald National Airport, Reagan National Airport, that is.
Absolutely. Wichita's my hometown, a very challenging time for my hometown. It's a very dense airspace. You have Dulles, you have Baltimore, Washington to the east, you have multiple military bases, you have Andrews, the president flies in and out of there. So you want the absolute best there. You want those systems running, you want redundancy. You don't want these things to go down. When they do, that means the air traffic has to stop, everything backs up, they have to stack up, they have to divert, and it just causes a huge chain reaction throughout the rest of the air traffic control system, throughout the entire country with air up. So are motivated, and there's a lot of reasoning to keep things working on a positive level. But whether or not there were enough controllers in the sky, whether or not the training of these pilots were correct, or perhaps if the commercial aircraft, the American jet, started its descent too early and also maybe wasn't reporting its position correctly, maybe they had a system issue or not. We don't know yet, but the black boxes are going to answer a lot of those questions.
Yeah, and can you speak to those black boxes? We obviously not one but two black boxes recovered from the Potomac River, and it's also been speculated that perhaps a similar instrument was recovered from the Black Hawk helicopter as well. Is that the case?
It's entirely possible to explain the black boxes on the commercial aircraft are basically recording every single control input, engine status, fuel flow, where all the computers working, all the built-in test equipment, all the error fault reporting are going to be on that black box. I'm not too familiar with what system they may have on the helicopter, but still, considering the fact that it didn't, it's not burst into flames when it crashed, they're going to be able to determine what the last control input was on the aircraft. They're going to know what the status of the aircraft engines were, or perhaps the blades of the helicopter, or the radio systems, or its navigation, or its radar, altitude, all of those things. They're going to be able to know all of that.
Let's talk about the actual recovery mission that's currently underway. We know that divers are battling mud, zero visibility, and painstakingly recovering that crash, that wreckage that now sits at the bottom of the Potomac River. Can you talk about how challenging that is as someone that specializes in recovery for those divers to be dealing with those conditions?
Oh, it is just a very challenging scenario when you consider the temperature. Those divers wouldn't be able to stay in the water for very long. But considering proximity to the shore, I'm sure they're probably switching out on a regular basis, bringing new divers in, sending the old divers out, trying to recover those bodies. As we've all recovered quite a few. I'm sure they're probably trying to maybe remove some debris or clear the path to recover the other bodies. The water is dark, it's churned. At night, when the accident actually happened, you wouldn't be able to see your hand in front of your face. Even with floodlights under the water and over the water, it would be a very, very challenging and dark environment, just even though that water wasn't very deep whatsoever. You just can't imagine how challenging that would be, and let alone to survive in those incidents. We were hoping that maybe there was a bubble of air where some of these folks might have actually survived. We were hoping that perhaps someone might have been thrown clear. There were early reports that may have encouraged that, but unfortunately it wasn't. And I can see just by that video, I'm pretty sure that they probably didn't even know what was happening to them. It happened very, very quickly. So I doubt anyone really suffered, if that's any consolation.
Wow, yet again, so tragic. We know that rain is actually playing a part in the recovery mission today as well. Can you talk about how that can perhaps impede on that recovery?
Well, it'll cause a shimmer on the surface. It could cause the silt on the floor of the river to maybe to move up a little bit. Of course, it makes it a little bit colder considering the air temperature. So with rain and wind, those first responders are going to be exposed to the elements. And we're all human beings, and we can only stay out in the cold for as long as we can. But there is a particular motivation and a particular drive that it's in you when you want to become a police officer or a fireman or an EMT, or quite frankly, when you want to join the military. You have this innate desire to do your job. You have this innate desire to rescue and save lives. Uh, it's not something that can really be fully explained or put into words until you actually experience it or see it in action.
Mr. Kurdian, obviously, with the loss of so many lives, 67, we know 14 bodies have still yet to be recovered thus far. It's fair that Americans, several Americans, a number, if you will, are now somewhat scared to fly, known as flight anxiety, scared to board a commercial flight and take off and go from point A to point B. I would ask you, how does one deal with something like that when, yet again, this is playing over and over in the minds of so many Americans?
Well, to your point, this is big news. It makes for news that people want to see and want to watch because they're fascinated by it. And, not to be macabre, but it brings in ratings. But at the same time, folks have got to understand the last major accident that we had in this country was 16 years ago. We don't have fatal accidents like this, whereas we see thousands of people, tens of thousands of people dying on our roads all the time. Flying is safe. Flying is great. I have a flight coming up next month and another one in March. I have no plans on changing those flights. In fact, one of those flights is going into Reagan National Airport. I'm putting myself on an airplane and I'm going to land at that airport. Okay. So if you have flights concerns, have faith in your pilots and the air traffic controllers to do their job correctly. We're all humans. We all make mistakes. Nobody is perfect. Obviously, when lives are on the line, you want to cross your T's and dot your I's a little bit more. There's the idea that maybe 1 in 10 to the ninth flight hours, something is allowed to perhaps go wrong. That is an exceptionally tight requirement and constraint. Accidents will happen, as they will happen all over the world in all manners of life. But I would encourage folks to keep flying. I'm going to keep flying. I'm not going to change my behavior.
All right, and so I'll end with this, and I'll pose the question yet again, and that is it safe to fly right now?
Absolutely safe to fly.
All right, very good. Yet again, Mr. Armen Kurdian, U.S. Navy Captain, retired, joining us here right on the Fox 5 Live Zone. Truly appreciate your time, sir. Thank you so much for coming on the show.
Thanks, Guy. Have a great weekend.
Well, as you heard me make mention, the question has been posed. Is it safe to fly? Does one want to fly? And what is it to fly? Joining us now happens to be a pilot. Yes, Mr. Donte Mills back here on the Fox 5 Live Zone. Good to see you, sir. Welcome to the show.
Good to see you. Good to see you.
Donte, first of all, I did not know you happen to be a pilot.
Yes, I've been flying for a little over 3 years now. It started out as a hobby of mine, and now I use it for work when I travel for different cases and trials. And I understand the importance of it. And the first thing that we're taught is to see and avoid. You make sure that there are no other planes, nothing else around you. That's the most important thing. So you see something like this and you're just curious as to how this could happen, because I'm a novice, right? Only a couple of years. These pilots were very experienced. One had over 1,000 flight hours, which is a lot of experience. So it's hard to understand how this happened.
Yeah, Donte, we're getting word that a similar incident took place the day before the collision. The pilot had to abort landing because of another military aircraft flying in its path. Yet again, this is a recurring issue, something that, well, Americans say this should not be happening.
I agree. And there's congestion there at that airport. I've flown in and out of that airport. But there's congestion at a lot of airports, so you can't blame it on that. We're used to, as pilots, knowing how to avoid that. And generally what you do is you get in line for a landing. Even if you have to circle around, there's a certain path that you take. But what's curious here is the height that these helicopters are flying at. And you talk about what happened the day before, where it was avoided because that helicopter came onto the screen and the flight that was coming in decided to go around and try to come back around for a landing and not risk a collision by landing that first time. It didn't happen on the day of that crash. In fact, the crash happened because the altitude of that helicopter, it was just flying too high. You don't know why. And I'm curious as to if they were working on some kind of stealth mission where they had maybe their instruments off. The lights on the helicopter you were very low. You could barely see it. So maybe that was the purpose of the training to night fly with no lights and no instruments for stealth mode. And that made it difficult for anybody around to see and avoid what was happening. It's also of note that with the flight like that commercial flight coming in, they're in slow flight when you're coming into landing. And that's really difficult to do. That's the most important or most difficult part of flying is slow flight. When you're coming in for a landing, you have less control and less movement that you can make. So that commercial flight didn't have much opportunity to avoid it, even if they saw it kind of late. I do believe, and we'll look at the investigation, but that helicopter had the responsibility to make sure that it saw, it avoided, and it wasn't in the path of that commercial flight coming in.
Donte, according to the Aviation Union, they state, quote, the United States is the gold standard for aviation safety. Following this incident, is that really the case?
It's the case. And I will say this. Listen, I'm a lawyer. I do practice aviation law. I've sued airlines on behalf of passengers. I've represented some airlines in some cases. But flying is safe in the United States. And I say this all the time in my practice. It's safer to be on an airplane than it is in a car. These things don't happen often, which is why this is getting so much attention. Now, we have to understand that people who are passengers on flights, you're afraid of this because you don't have any control when you're in the air. And also, if an accident happens, it can be catastrophic, as it is here. You see, there's no survivors. But it doesn't happen often. Most pilots, they have that basic understanding of see and avoid, and it works. And the FAA has regulations, and there's different devices. When I fly, not only do I have my instruments, but I keep an iPad with me that alerts me to anything that's around me. And I get those signals, and I make sure that I avoid it. So flying is safe, and I don't want people to be afraid to fly. These accidents do not happen often. It's really regulated, and they do a great job. Nothing is perfect, though. But you still can investigate this to see why it happened and try to make sure that it doesn't happen again.
Yet again, to your point, it is safer to fly than it is to be inside of a car. Very well said. Donte Mills joining us right here on the Live Zone. Thank you so much for your time, sir. We appreciate you.
Thank you.